Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling called her in front of the attending physicians gathered around the third-floor cardiac unit at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning. Not her name. Not Laura. Just a nurse, as if she were furniture, as if she were interchangeable with the 4 stands and blood pressure monitors. He had no idea she'd spent 12 years as a senior chief petty officer conducting emergency field surgeries under fire in Helmand Province. He had no idea that her hands had held the lives of 17 Marines together when their convoy was ambushed outside Sanjin Valley. He had no idea she existed under that faded scrub uniform at all. Dead wrong. And 3 hours later, the entire hospital would know it. What happened next changed everything. Laura Bennett moved through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial in San Diego like a ghost that had learned to take a pulse. 8 years. 8 years of arriving at 5:45 a.m., before the hospital cafeteria opened, before the day shift nurses clustered in the break room with their coffee and their gossip. 8 years of checking vitals on cardiac patients with hands that could perform a needle decompression in under 90 seconds, now reduced to organizing medication trays and answering call lights and saying of course, doctor, to men who'd never been taught what respect actually cost. She wore her scrubs like a uniform still, though the only insignia anyone saw was her employee badge and the hospital's rectangular logo. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining remained exactly where she'd placed it 3,000 days ago, pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat, hidden beneath layers of professional invisibility. Her fingers moved across the third-floor cardiac monitor with practiced economy. She didn't rush. She didn't fumble. She assessed each patient with the efficiency of someone trained to triage under mortar fire, to separate the salvageable from the already gone in seconds that felt like hours. Sinus rhythm on monitor 3. Atrial fibrillation, controlled, on monitor 4. The elderly woman in 312 needed her oxygen concentration increased from 31% to 34%. Laura made the adjustment, documented it, and moved to the next room without speaking. The other nurses, Stephanie, Marcus, Jennifer, they'd learned by year 2 that Laura Bennett didn't do happy hour. She didn't discuss her past. She didn't explain why she flinched at helicopter sounds in the distance or why she could place and fall line without looking. She simply existed in the hospital's ecosystem as a perfectly functioning part, reliable, silent, permanent as the fluorescent lights. At 8:47 a.m., the elevator doors opened and the Marine General walked in with a cardiologist on either side of him. Decorated officer. For decades of service. Chest-bearing medals that caught the fluorescent light like reflections off water. He moved like a man accustomed to rooms parting for him, to people straightening when he entered. Laura was adjusting and fall line on a post-operative patient when she felt his gaze settle on her hands. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge it. Her fingers continued their work, the way she positioned the tape, the precise angle of the catheter, the controlled steadiness of someone who'd done this in a field hospital with incoming fire rattling the canvas walls. The general watched for 14 seconds, something shifting in his expression, something like recognition. Then his attending cardiologist guided him toward the isolation unit they'd prepared, and Laura returned the privacy curtain to its place and made a note in the patient chart. The morning progressed with the rhythm of any Tuesday. Vitals at 9. Labs at 9:30. A new admission came in around 10, a post-operative surgical patient with borderline blood pressure that made Laura's training instinct sharpen. She mentioned it to the resident. The resident said they'd monitor. Laura said nothing else, though her jaw tightened, though she touched the patch inside her jacket twice in the following 2 hours when she couldn't see the patient herself. This was the arrangement she'd made with herself in year 1, the agreement that kept her alive and employed and invisible. You don't order, you suggest. You don't command, you defer. You exist in the space between silence and service, and you never, ever let anyone see what you were before. Dr. Sterling arrived for morning rounds at 10:55. He moved through the unit like a man who believed his presence improved buildings, like his white coat was a crown. His reputation in the hospital preceded him by 3 minutes, 15 years on staff, boardroom connections that reached into San Diego's wealthiest foundations, relationships with attending physicians that translated into power that had nothing to do with medical knowledge and everything to do with the kind of leverage that protected him. He was the sort of man who'd made a bet with the attending physician 7 days ago. A wager. Money exchanged in the cafeteria. That Laura Bennett would quit within her first week. She'd lasted 8 years, but Dr. Sterling had a long memory and an excellent capacity for resentment. He stopped at the nurse's station where Laura was updating a patient chart. The entire third floor could see him there, could see the way his eyes moved across her face with the dismissiveness of someone examining a stain. He didn't speak to her first. He spoke about her, loud enough for the attending physicians to hear, loud enough for Stephanie and Marcus to exchange glances. Bennett. My office. Now. Not a request. Not when you have a moment. A command issued as if she were subordinate in rank, as if her 8 years of perfect shift performance had somehow positioned her beneath him. Laura set down her pen. She closed the patient chart. She stood, and her movement was so controlled, so measured, that it might have been choreographed. She passed him and walked toward his office without a word. Dr. Sterling's office was on the far end of the third floor, past the supply room that always smelled of bleach and plastic tubing. Laura had never been inside it before. She'd seen him enter and exit, had seen other nurses emerge looking shaken or angry, but she'd never been called to that space herself. He closed the door behind them with a soft click. She remained standing. He sat behind a desk that held a photo of his family and a diploma from Columbia. He looked at her the way someone might look at a disappointing hire, already mentally calculating the termination paperwork. "I'm making a change," he said. "You're being reassigned. Effective immediately. You're moving to the post-operative floor. Night shift. Monday through Friday. You'll report to Rachel Chen." He was watching her face, waiting for something, a flinch, a tremor, a crack in her composure. Laura's expression didn't change. "Do you understand?" "Yes, doctor." Her voice was even. Deferential. The voice of someone who'd learned to survive by making herself smaller. "Effective tonight," he continued, leaning back in his chair. "Clear out your locker by end of day. I don't want your personal items mixing with the cardiac unit supplies." He turned to his computer screen, dismissing her. That's all. She left his office and returned to the third floor. The other nurses pretended they hadn't been watching. Stephanie turned toward her patient's monitor. Marcus made a note in a chart. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. Laura continued her rounds as if nothing had changed, though something in her chest had shifted, something like the moment before a fuse is lit. She touched the patch inside her jacket. Once. Twice. A reflex. A prayer. A reminder. At 12:30, she went to the hospital cafeteria. She was due a break. She was entitled to lunch. She loaded a tray with a salad and a sandwich and a container of apple juice, and she was walking back toward the third floor when Dr. Sterling entered from the opposite direction with 2 attending physicians flanking him. He saw her. His eyes moved to her tray. She saw the calculation happen on his face. She saw him decide something in the space of a single breath. He reached out as he passed. His hand caught the edge of her tray, not accidentally, not clumsily, but with the precision of someone who'd planned the motion. Her lunch scattered across the tile floor. The salad container spilled. The sandwich landed face down. The apple juice shattered and spread across the floor in a sticky amber puddle. The attendings laughed. One of them actually laughed. Dr. Sterling smiled, the smile of a man who'd been handed permission to test the boundaries of what he could do. "Careful, Bennett," he said, his voice carrying across the corridor. "Watch your step." The other nurses had stopped. The corridor had gone dead silent. Laura looked at her scattered meal. She looked at the wet tile. She looked at Dr. Sterling's face, at the satisfaction there, at the absolute certainty that he'd just broken something. And then she bent down. Her movements were economical. Controlled. She retrieved the salad container. She picked up the sandwich. She wiped her hands on a napkin from her pocket. She did not speak. She did not cry. She did not retreat. She simply worked, collecting the pieces of her lunch, and when she straightened, her eyes found Dr. Sterling's again and held them. "One day you'll understand what respect actually costs," she said. Her voice was quiet, steady as surgical steel. A single tear had escaped, the only crack in her composure, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact. "Until then, you're standing in my way." The attending physician stopped laughing. Dr. Sterling's expression shifted, something crossing his face that might have been anger or might have been something closer to fear. She walked around him, returned to the nurse's station, and disposed of her lunch in the trash. She clocked back in. She returned to her patients. The day continued. But that wasn't the worst part. At 2:07 p.m., while Laura was checking the Marine General's post-operative vitals for the third time in an hour, blood pressure stabilizing, heart rate steady, oxygen saturation at 98%, the General looked up from his pillow and held her gaze. His eyes were military eyes. Combat eyes. Eyes that had seen exactly what she was, exactly what she'd been trained to do. "Your suturing technique," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. "I've seen hands like that work in field hospitals. Sanjan Valley, maybe? Helmand." It wasn't a question. It was recognition. A name being called in a language only certain people spoke. "How many tours?" Laura's hand stilled on the blood pressure cuff. She didn't answer. She completed her assessment, documented it, and made a note that his vitals were stable. But as she turned to leave the room, the General's hand reached out and caught her wrist with surprising strength. "Senior Chief," he said. Not a question. A statement. A rank. A truth emerging from beneath 8 years of silence like a submarine breaking the surface of dark water. "That's who you are." Laura removed her wrist from his grip with controlled gentleness. She did not confirm. She did not deny. She simply nodded, the smallest acknowledgement, and left his room. She had 2 hours left on her shift. She had 30 minutes to clear her locker before night shift arrived. She had her reassignment to process and a new schedule to accept and the permanent weight of invisibility to carry forward. She didn't know that in exactly 3 hours, she would be standing in her kitchen while her teenage daughter found her still wearing her scrubs, still holding her hospital badge in trembling hands, unable to explain why she'd come home early. She didn't know that this moment, this quiet afternoon in the third-floor cardiac unit, was the last peaceful moment before everything she'd buried for 8 years would resurface like a body in a current, impossible to deny, impossible to hide any longer. She touched the patch inside her jacket one final time and returned to her patient charts, the fluorescent lights humming above her like the rotors of a Black Hawk helicopter, waiting for a call she'd always known would come. The morning rounds began like every other morning at Oak Creek Memorial, fluorescent lights buzzing their mechanical song, the smell of antiseptic mixing with cold coffee, monitors beeping their rhythmic pulse across the cardiac unit. Laura pushed the medication cart down the third-floor corridor, her clinical notes organized with military precision, each entry documented in the exact moment it occurred. She'd learned long ago that precision kept you alive. In hospitals, it just kept people from dying. Dr. Sterling stood in the conference room 3 doors down, visible through the glass partition. Laura could see him gesturing toward her like she was a specimen under examination. She kept her eyes on her cart, but her hearing, trained by 8 years of field medicine, honed by 3 tours in Helmand Province, caught every word. "I'm giving her 1 week," Sterling announced to the assembled attending physicians. "Anyone want to take that bet?" "New nurse, no spine, she'll quit before Friday." 3 doctors laughed. 1 extended his hand. Sterling shook it with the confidence of a man who'd never experienced real consequences, whose worst day was a missed golf reservation. Laura continued charting vitals on a patient who couldn't see her, keeping her movement steady, her jaw unclenched, her breathing even. This was nothing. This was noise. That afternoon in the cafeteria, she carried her lunch tray past Sterling's table where he sat with two board members, their voices carrying the weight of institutional power, voices that approved budgets, voices that hired and fired. Sterling extended his foot casually, a gesture so practiced it barely registered as intentional. The tray's edge caught against his Italian leather shoe. Soup splashed across the tile floor like spilled blood. Silverware clattered in a cascade of sound that echoed through the entire cafeteria. 50 staff members turned to stare. Sterling didn't even look up from his conversation with the board members. He laughed, the kind of laugh that made lesser people small, and said without lifting his eyes, "Clumsy, aren't we?" Laura took one measured breath. She set down her empty tray on a nearby table with the precision of someone defusing an explosive device. She kneeled slowly on the tile floor, her scrubs pressing against the wet surface, and began gathering scattered food, lettuce, tomatoes, the wooden spoon that had rolled toward the trash bin. Around her, whispers started. A nurse she'd worked with for 3 years pretended to suddenly need a napkin dispenser. Another averted his eyes entirely. A single tear escaped down Laura's cheek. She wiped it away deliberately, methodically, without breaking her focus on the mess. Her hands were steady. They had held pressure on an arterial bleed while mortar rounds landed 30 meters away. They had performed emergency cricothyrotomy in a tent with 2 flashlights and no anesthesia. They had closed wounds that should have been impossible to close. They would not shake because a man in a $5,000 suit had kicked her lunch tray. She stood, disposed of the ruined food, and walked out of that cafeteria with her head level, her shoulders back, her breathing controlled. Behind her, Sterling's laughter continued, already moving on to the next joke at someone else's expense. 2 days later, morning rounds began in the cardiac unit. Dr. Sterling reviewed a patient's chart as he walked past Laura's station, his movements deliberate, his eyes tracking her response. He approached the patient's bedside where Laura was adjusting the foredrip, checking the fluid level with the kind of attention that made the difference between a patient stabilizing and deteriorating. Sterling threw the chart at her feet. The papers scattered across the tile floor like confetti. No one moved. The entire unit had gone silent, the monitors still beeped, the ventilators still wheezed, but the human sound stopped entirely. Laura felt every eye in the room lock onto her in that suspended moment. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice carrying the tone of a man addressing someone far beneath him. "And next time, maybe try documenting vitals correctly. Or is basic nursing too complicated for you?" Laura bended down, her movements measured and deliberate. She retrieved the chart with steady hands and stood, meeting his gaze directly. Her eyes were level with his, and something in that moment, something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with absolute clarity, shifted the air between them. One tear traced down her cheek. She wiped it with the back of her wrist, deliberately, and spoke in a voice quiet enough that everyone in the unit leaned forward to hear it. "One day you'll understand what respect actually costs." Sterling's smirk faltered for half a second. He recovered it quickly, sneered, and turned away, dismissing her from his attention entirely. But that half-second of hesitation, that was the moment he realized he'd miscalculated something. He just didn't know what yet. The Marine General watched from his bed 15 feet away, his cardiac monitors displaying a rhythm that was stable but weak. His eyes were alert. His mind was still sharp beneath the medication. He had spent 32 years wearing the uniform of the United States Marine Corps, commanding men, reading situations the way most people read newspapers. He'd watched Laura's hands as she retrieved the chart. He'd seen the precision of her movements, the absence of shame, the controlled mechanism of her response. He'd seen something else too, a scar tissue pattern on her left wrist, visible for just a moment as her sleeve pulled back. A scar that matched shrapnel wounds he'd seen before, in a medical tent in Kandahar, 8 years ago, in hands that belonged to someone who wasn't supposed to exist anymore. When Laura came to adjust his monitors an hour later, her composure fully restored, her professional mask back in place, the general gripped her wrist. His voice was hoarse from the cardiac medications and exhaustion, but his words were precisely chosen. "You're a combat medic," he whispered. I've seen those hands work in field hospitals. Helmand Province. Laura's face went white. Not from fear. From recognition that 8 years of disappearance, 8 years of being nobody, 8 years of carefully constructed civilian identity had just been recognized by someone whose memory couldn't be anything but accurate. Her hand trembled, not from weakness, but from the collision of two incompatible versions of herself trying to occupy the same body. She shook her head once, slowly. "You're mistaken, sir." "No," the general said, his grip tightening slightly on her wrist. "I'm not." Laura gently removed his hand, saying nothing more, and left the room. Her movements were controlled, but her breathing had changed. In the hallway, she paused for exactly 3 seconds, her hand touching the inside of her jacket where the faded unit patch was sewn into the lining, the patch that had survived 8 years of washing, 8 years of hiding, 8 years of waiting for someone to remember who she actually was. That evening, the night shift brought chaos to the emergency department. A trauma case came through at 11:36 p.m., a former Taliban commander, now a refugee with valid asylum status, admitted with shrapnel wounds from an old IED that had shifted position and caused active internal bleeding. The ER was overwhelmed with 3 simultaneous traumas and 2 critical admits. Someone called upstairs, they needed an extra set of hands on the floor. Laura answered the call. She had no way of knowing what was about to happen, no way of predicting that the bridge between her 2 lives was about to collapse entirely. She entered the trauma bay wearing a surgical mask, her mind already shifting into the clinical space where she excelled, a space where survival was mathematics, where blood loss could be calculated, where the human body became a system of pressures and flows. She established an 4 line with a 16-gauge needle, the insertion smooth, the flow rate immediate. The surgical resident called out orders in rapid fire, type and cross, 2 units packed cells ready, trauma surgery on standby, prepare for exploratory laparotomy. The patient, semi-conscious and delirious with pain, suddenly locked eyes with Laura over her surgical mask. His eyes went wide. Recognition flooded across his face, not the blank recognition of a stranger, but the specific, personal recognition of someone who had encountered you in the worst moment of their life. He began shouting in Pashto, words fast and urgent, then switched to broken English. "You. The American devil. The woman doctor in the medical tent." Laura's hands continued moving. She was establishing a second line, her movements automatic, her focus locked on the clinical task. She did not stop. She did not freeze. She did not acknowledge that every officer in that trauma bay had turned to stare at her. "You saved my brother." The patient grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for someone losing blood at this rate. "The tent." "You pulled the metal from his chest." Laura firmly removed his hand, said "You're confused from blood loss," and stepped back while 2 security guards moved closer to the patient. The ER attending, Dr. Morrison, a woman who'd worked with Laura for 6 years without knowing anything about her, looked between them, confused but focused on the bleeding that wouldn't stop. She had no context for what she was witnessing, only the immediate crisis of a trauma patient who needed surgery in less than 10 minutes. Laura excused herself by claiming another patient needed her upstairs. No one questioned her. She walked out of that trauma bay on steady legs and took the stairs instead of the elevator, needing movement, needing air, needing the passage of time and distance between herself and what had just happened in that room. In the stairwell, she leaned against the cold concrete wall and touched the patch inside her jacket. Her heart was accelerating past safe parameters. She controlled her breathing the way she'd controlled it 8 years ago, in Helmand Province, when everything fell apart and the government told her to disappear. She was upstairs checking the Marine General's monitor when she found the irregular rhythm, atrial fibrillation, not dangerous yet but trending toward instability. She adjusted his medications, ran a fresh EKG, and documented her findings with precise notation. He gripped her hand weakly when she reached for the 4. "That man downstairs," he whispered. "If he recognized you from Helmand, then you were there when." "Sir, please rest," Laura said, and her voice had changed. It was no longer deferential. It was a command. "Your heart needs stability, not stress." The general released her hand. He was quiet for a moment, studying her face with the eyes of a man who'd spent decades reading soldiers. "How long have you been hiding, Senior Chief?" She didn't answer. She adjusted his medications, made a notation on his chart, and left his room. Her hands were no longer trembling. They were sharp. Ready. The mask was back in place, but something underneath it had shifted irrevocably. At the nurse's station, she found Dr. Sterling reviewing something on his tablet, the ER incident report, she realized, the documentation from the trauma case downstairs. His eyes moved across the screen with predatory interest. He looked up as she approached, and his smile was a knife. "Interesting interaction downstairs, Bennett," he said quietly, just loud enough for her alone to hear. "The patient's asylum lawyer is already asking questions about the interaction with our staff. Care to explain why a Taliban refugee seems to know your face?" Laura stood very still. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like rotors. She could hear her own heartbeat, steady and controlled, like the pulse of a distant helicopter approaching. "Sir," she said, her voice level. "The patient," Sterling continued, closing his tablet slowly, savoring the moment, mentioned something about a woman doctor in a medical tent. 8 years ago. He's requesting your name for his legal documentation. Very interested in locating you again, apparently. His lawyer is calling the hospital administrator right now." Behind him, through the glass partition of the unit, the Marine General watched from his bed, his monitors displaying a rhythm that had finally stabilized. His eyes met Laura's across the distance, and in that moment, she knew that the 8-year silence was over. Everything buried was about to surface, and there was no longer anywhere to hide. 3 hours. That's how long Laura had been trying not to think about what the Taliban commander's words meant, what they implied about the 8-year silence cracking open like thin ice. She'd finished her shift notes in the break room, staring at the clock above the refrigerator as it ticked toward the evening rounds. The fluorescent hum of Oak Creek Memorial surrounded her like white noise, steady and constant, the sound of a world that didn't know it was about to change. She'd checked her scrub pocket twice for the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, still there, still hidden, still the only physical proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett had ever existed. At 7:13 p.m., she pushed through the third-floor corridor toward room 312. The Marine General was her responsibility tonight. His condition had been stable during morning rounds, cardiac recovery progressing on schedule, vitals nominal, the kind of patient who was supposed to be easier as time passed. She'd made a point of checking on him regularly, and he'd made a point of watching her with recognition in his eyes that no one else could read. The monitors outside his room displayed his continuous EKG tracing in real time, green lines dancing across dark screens with the rhythm of a recovering heart. Everything looked normal. She didn't expect normal to break. The door to room 312 closed behind her with the soft pneumatic hiss of a hospital door sealing. The Marine General was awake, propped on pillows, the kind of alert that suggested he was thinking about something far away. His monitors showed blood pressure 128/76, heart rate 78, O2 saturation 97% on room air. All of it textbook recovery. Laura moved to the monitor to document his vitals in the electronic record, and that's when she noticed it, the jugular venous pressure line climbing slightly higher than it had been 6 hours ago. Not dramatically. Just enough. Fluid accumulation. Her hands went still. "You checking something specific?" His voice was hoarse but steady, the voice of a man used to being heard in rooms full of people. Laura didn't answer immediately. She was reading the numbers, the subtle shift in readings that meant something was compressing the general's heart. Not the initial cardiac injury, that was healing as expected. This was new. This was happening now. "Your pressure's been dropping." She adjusted the monitor so she could see the waveform more clearly. The pressure tracing showed the characteristic equalization that meant fluid was restricting the heart's ability to fill. Cardiac tamponade. The word arrived in her mind like a command from the past, a diagnosis she'd made dozens of times in field hospitals in Helmand Province where helicopters couldn't land and surgery was whatever you could do with what you had. "How long have you been feeling tight in your chest?" 20 minutes. Maybe 30. He shifted slightly, gasping as the movement increased the pressure inside his chest cavity. I didn't want to call the nurse. Figured it was just... Don't move. Laura was already moving toward the door. Her hands felt steady. Her breathing was steady. The composure that had kept her alive in places where composure was the only thing between breathing and not breathing had settled over her like a familiar uniform. Your heart's filling with fluid. We need to drain it. Now. She hit the code button. Not the emergency code, the urgent response code that meant a patient was deteriorating but not yet in full arrest. The button made a soft clicking sound, almost gentle, completely at odds with the cascade it triggered. Within seconds, her radio crackled, code response, 3rd floor, room 312. The equipment she needed was in the crash cart 3 doors down. Pericardiocentesis tray, needle, syringe, ultrasound probe, local anesthetic, sterile drapes. She could perform this procedure. She'd performed it 17 times in the field, in tents lit by chemical glow sticks, while the sound of helicopters approached from a distance that was never far enough. In a hospital with ultrasound and proper sterile technique and a team of trained staff, it should have been routine. Should have been. She was pulling the crash cart back into the room when Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway, his white coat perfectly pressed, his expression already hardening into the shape of authority. Behind him came 2 residents and 4 nurses, moving toward the room with the coordinated urgency of a code response. Sterling's eyes found hers across the room, and something in his expression shifted. Not concern. Recognition, maybe. The recognition that she was about to do something. What's the situation? He demanded, moving to the monitor. Cardiac tamponade. Pressure equalization across all chambers, JVP elevated, patient showing signs of hemodynamic compromise. His BP's down to 104/62 from 128/76. Laura was already prepping the tray, her hands moving with the muscle memory that 8 years of civilian nursing couldn't erase. We need to decompress the pericardium. I can have the needle in and fluid draining in less than 2 minutes. Sterling's jaw tightened. He stepped between her and the cart. Step away from that patient, Bennett. We wait for cardiology. No cowboy medicine in my unit. The monitor beeped again. Blood pressure 98/58 now. Dropping faster. The rhythm was still organized on the EKG, but the electrical activity and the mechanical output were becoming decoupled. The general's lips were starting to show the early signs of cyanosis, that faint blue tinge that meant his peripheral tissues weren't getting enough oxygen. For minutes, maybe less, before the pressure became so high that the heart simply stopped pumping against it. He has for minutes, Laura said quietly. Cardiology is 20 minutes away. I said step back. That's a direct order. Touch him and you're done. Sterling moved to position himself directly between her and the patient, his presence like a barrier constructed from privilege and certainty and the absolute conviction that the hierarchy of the hospital was more important than the patient in the bed. Everyone here is a witness to what happens next. The room had gone very still. 8 nurses, 3 residents, all of them watching. The general's breathing had become shallow, labored. His hand gripped the rail of the bed with white knuckles. Laura could feel the weight of the moment pressing down like the same weight she'd felt in Helmand Province when a convoy was ambushed and 17 Marines were relying on her hands to be smarter and faster than whatever was trying to kill them. She took one measured breath. The kind of breath that steadied her in moments when steadiness was the only answer to chaos. Then I'm done. She moved past Sterling, not forcefully, just with absolute certainty, the kind of movement that didn't ask permission because it didn't recognize the authority that was trying to grant or refuse it. Her shoulder brushed his chest, and she was opening the sterile field of the pericardiocentesis tray, draping the general's chest with sterile cloth, her fingers finding the landmarks of his anatomy with the precision of someone who had mapped 1,000 bodies in conditions far worse than this. Everyone here is a witness. Sterling was already on his phone, already stepping back because even he understood that stopping her now would require him to physically restrain her, and that would be a different kind of violence. She's performing an unauthorized procedure against direct orders. The ultrasound probe was in her hand. A quick sweep to confirm the fluid collection. There it was, dark and free-flowing around the heart. The needle was next, a 14-gauge catheter needle connected to a syringe, sterile and ready. She palpated the fifth intercostal space, subcostal approach, and the needle went in with the kind of precision that came from hands that had practiced this in field hospitals lit by emergency lanterns and flashlights held by people covered in sand and fear. 90 seconds. That's all the procedure took. The needle advanced toward the pericardial sac, and Laura watched the ultrasound screen as the tip appeared in the field. 2 centimeters, maybe 3. The needle tip touched the fluid collection, and she drew back on the syringe. The hiss of air escaping as negative pressure pulled fluid into the barrel, dark, serous fluid that had been slowly choking the Marine General's heart for the last half hour. 20 milliliters. 40. 60. The monitor showed the pressure tracing beginning to separate, the chambers beginning to fill independently again. The general's color returned almost instantly, pink returning to the edges of his lips. His breathing deepened. The monitor's rhythm accelerated slightly as the heart, now free from the weight of fluid compressing it, beat with renewed force. Laura withdrew the needle, applied pressure with sterile gauze, and stepped back. The entire procedure took 90 seconds. The entire third-floor staff had watched it through the glass walls of the room, witnessed the movement of a hand that knew exactly where it was going, that understood the geometry of a body and the pressure required to save it. "He's stable," Laura said quietly, peeling off her gloves. Her voice hadn't changed. Her breathing hadn't changed. The composure that had kept her alive in places where composure was the only thing between breathing and not breathing was still in place, still steady, still the mask she'd worn for 8 years. She looked at Sterling, and her eyes were flat and cold and carried the weight of a question that had no answer. "Write me up." Sterling was already walking, already on his phone, already speaking to someone about gross insubordination and immediate suspension and investigation. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence that filled the room after he left, the kind of silence that happens when everyone in the room has just watched the hierarchy of a hospital reveal itself as less important than a patient who needed saving. The Marine General reached out and caught Laura's wrist before she could turn to leave. His grip was weak but intentional. "Thank you, Senior Chief," he said, and the words were loud enough that everyone in the room heard them. The words that named her, that revealed her, that brought the 8-year silence crashing down like the walls of a building finally understanding it was time to fall. The needle was still in her hand when Sterling's voice became a weapon. "Protocol violation." His scream cut across the trauma bay like shrapnel. "You performed a critical procedure without attending supervision. That's grounds for immediate." Laura didn't look up. Her eye stayed on the Marine General's monitor. Oxygen saturation climbing. 91. 94. The numbers were steady now, climbing like a rope being thrown to a drowning man. She secured the needle with tape, her movements precise and economical, the kind of precision that came from having done this in a burning field hospital with rounds coming through the canvas walls. His tamponade was resolving, she said quietly. Her voice had dropped an octave. His vitals were collapsing. "You saw the JVD. I saw insubordination." Sterling was pointing now, his face the color of raw meat. "Get security. Get compliance. Get administration. Now." But Laura was already moving past him. There were vitals to document, a procedure note to write, an attending physician somewhere who needed to understand what had just happened in his absence. The Marine General's hand reached out as she passed. His fingers caught her wrist for half a second. "Thank you," he said. Barely audible. But the words carried weight that made the entire room understand what had just been spoken. Sterling heard it too. The attending physician, a younger doctor named Chen who'd been in the supply room when the tamponade occurred, stood frozen near the crash cart. His eyes moved from the Marine General's stable monitor to Laura's profile to Sterling's crimson face. In that moment, Chen made a choice. He didn't say anything. He just began filling out the chart, documenting Laura's procedure with clinical precision, which meant documenting her expertise, her decisiveness, her understanding of emergency intervention in ways that would make any jury understand that what she'd done was medicine at its most essential. Sterling left the trauma bay at 3:06 p.m. He was gone for exactly 40 minutes. Laura was at the medication station on the 3rd floor, finishing her documentation, when Patricia Reeves appeared with a laptop. Reeves was the hospital's compliance investigator, a woman with grey hair twisted into a bun so tight it seemed to pull her entire face backward, a woman who'd spent 23 years at Oak Creek Memorial making sure nurses followed procedures and doctors didn't get sued. She didn't look at Laura. She began pulling files from a drawer labeled Bennett, L. Sterling was already on the phone in his office. Laura could hear his voice carrying through the open door, performing his destruction like a conductor working through a symphony he'd been planning for weeks. "Yes, Dr. Whitmore, I understand you're in back-to-back meetings, but this is urgent. We have a nursing staff member who just performed an authorized critical care without supervision. A pericardiocentesis. Yes, an advanced intervention. No, she's not credentialed for independent critical procedures." A pause. "I have her employment file right here. There are inconsistencies we need to address immediately." The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical dirge. Laura kept her hand steady as she documented the procedure in the electronic medical record, each keystroke precise, each detail clinical, each action already knowing it was being watched now. Reeves was on the phone too, her voice softer but no less dangerous. "Yes, I'm calling to verify employment status for a Laura Bennett. She listed you as a reference in 2016? I see. And the phone number on file, the main hospital line at that institution, that's no longer a valid number. Interesting. And her supervisor's name was listed as Michael Torres, RN, but you don't have any record of that individual ever working in your system. I understand. Thank you." Sterling made 3 more calls in the next 18 minutes. Each one to a board member. Each one performed loudly enough that the entire nurses' station could hear him describing Laura's actions as cowboy medicine, dangerous precedent, potential liability, credential irregularities. He used phrases like pattern of behavior and background inconsistencies and need to investigate her entire 8-year tenure here. The words were designed to make a good nurse sound like a ticking bomb. At 4:23 p.m., Reeves closed her laptop and walked directly to Laura. She didn't sit down. She stood at the medication station like a judge delivering a sentence. "Laura Bennett, you're suspended pending investigation into multiple policy violations and credential irregularities." Her voice was formal, the kind of voice that belonged in courtrooms and disciplinary hearings. "Please surrender your badge and leave the premises immediately. We'll be conducting a comprehensive review of your 8 years of medical decisions and patient care documentation." The metal badge felt heavier in Laura's hand than it should have. She'd worn it every day for 2,920 days. It had her photo from when she'd still believed that leaving her past behind meant she could actually leave her past behind. She set it on the counter with steady hands. No trembling. No protests. Just a nurse removing her badge the way any suspended employee removes a badge, carefully, as if it might somehow remember her even after she was gone. Sterling watched from his office doorway. His arms were crossed. His smile was the smile of a man who'd finally won something he'd been fighting for since the moment he met her. He didn't know that he was smiling at the moment his life began to end. He didn't know that the words Senior Chief Petty Officer were already being typed into secure military databases. He didn't know that his next 48 hours would contain more gravity than his entire previous career. Security arrived at 4:31 p.m. 2 officers in their grey uniforms, looking uncomfortable with the task. They escorted Laura through the main lobby at shift change, the worst possible time, when day shift and night shift overlapped and the lobbies were thick with staff moving in different directions. A nurse named Stephanie pulled out her phone. A resident named Kumar did the same. 3 people filmed Laura walking between the security officers, her shoulders back, her head up, one hand pressing against something beneath her jacket, something small that had survived 8 years of pretending to be a civilian. She didn't cry. She didn't look back. She just walked through the automatic doors into the San Diego evening, where the ocean was somewhere south and her daughter was waiting and everything she'd buried was about to come back up through the earth whether she was ready or not. The drive home took 18 minutes. The silence in the car took longer. Megan was downstairs at 6:06 p.m., moving toward the refrigerator the way 17-year-olds do when they're hungry and homework is finished and the house feels normal until it doesn't. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and found her mother sitting at the table in full scrubs, her hospital badge and ID badge laid out in front of her like evidence in a trial nobody had asked for. "Mom." Megan's voice was careful, the way it got when she understood something was wrong but hadn't yet understood what. "Why are you home early? Did something happen?" Laura tried to answer. Her throat closed like a fist. The words that existed in her brain, I saved someone, I performed a procedure, I broke the rules to keep a man alive, and they suspended me for it, those words couldn't find a way out through the physics of grief and rage and 8 years of compartmentalize and suddenly failing all at once. Tears moved down her cheeks like they were following a map she'd memorized years ago. She didn't wipe them away. She just sat there, a woman in blue scrubs at a kitchen table, while her daughter watched her fall apart in a way that Megan had never seen before, in a way that suggested her mother had been holding something together for a very long time and the threads had finally snapped. "Did someone die?" Megan whispered, sitting down beside her. "Mom, did someone die?" Laura shook her head. She reached for her daughter's hand and found it already reaching for her, that small gesture of love that teenagers know instinctively, the way your body understands sometimes before your mind does that someone you love is drowning. "I saved someone," Laura whispered. "And now everything is gone." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she had no idea, sitting at that kitchen table with her daughter's hand in hers, that the phones were already ringing. That the Marine General was making calls to contacts he hadn't used in 15 years. That Navy investigators were pulling classified files that nobody was supposed to pull. That within 16 hours, the lobby of Oak Creek Memorial was going to fill with uniforms and cameras and voices loud enough to shake the wall Sterling had built his entire career on. The worst part was that Laura Bennett was about to stop being a nurse. And the United States Navy was about to stop forgetting she'd ever existed. The ER doors slid open at 11:08 p.m. and the stretcher came through trailing blood and chaos. Shrapnel wounds. Deep ones. The trauma team moved like muscle memory, but Laura froze for exactly 1 second when she saw the man's face on the stretcher. He was looking for her too. The recognition hit him first. His eyes locked onto hers across the controlled chaos of the trauma bay, and his voice cracked through the noise in Pashto-accented English, "American Devil. Medical tent. Helmand. You saved my brother when the convoy burned." Every head in the room turned. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Gloved hand stilled. Laura's jaw clenched, not fear. Recognition. The past she'd buried for 8 years was bleeding on a stretcher in front of 17 witnesses, and his gratitude was the thing that would finally destroy Dr. Sterling. A nurse whispered. Someone's phone rose. By the time Laura finished his primary survey, cataloging each wound with hands steady as surgical lasers, the story was already spreading through the hospital like sepsis. Former Taliban commander. Medical tent. Helmand Province. American Devil saved my brother. The implications spread faster than any infection. Laura finished her shift at 7 a.m. and walked to her locker in the staff room, still wearing scrubs darkened with another man's blood. Her daughter Megan was standing beside it. 17 years old, still in her school uniform, trembling in a way that had nothing to do with cold. "Mom." Megan's voice shook. "They're saying you're a senior chief petty officer." Laura opened her locker slowly. The faded unit patch was still there, sewn into the jacket lining where she'd kept it for 8 years, a Delta Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines insignia barely visible unless you knew where to look. "Megan. They're saying you were in Helmand Province. They're saying you saved people." Her daughter's eyes were wet. "They're saying you got medals." A file was on the bench beside Megan's backpack. Classified at the top, declassified stamp dated yesterday. Laura's hands didn't shake as she picked it up, but her breathing changed, the kind of controlled inhale that comes from having already survived worse. The words blurred and crystallized, Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism under fire. 2 Bronze Stars for Valor. 17 Marines saved during the Helmand Province convoy ambush, March 2015. Emergency field surgery under active enemy fire. Recommended for Medal of Valor, approved for Navy Cross. Tour extended 14 months. Secondary classification lifted at 8-year mark pending protective status review. Protective status. That's what they'd called it. That's what they'd forced her into. 8 years of disappearing, 8 years of absorbing insults from a man like Sterling, 8 years of being less than she'd been because what she actually was could compromise ongoing operations she wasn't allowed to talk about. Laura looked at her daughter. We should go home. They didn't make it to the parking lot. The hospital lobby doors opened at 8:15 a.m. and the rotor wash from helicopter rotors outside made every window rattle. Security personnel in dress uniforms came first, 3 of them, moving with the fluid precision of apex predators. Then a Navy SEAL team leader in dress blues, his presence making the air pressure in the lobby change like weather moving in. His voice carried through 800 square feet of lobby space the way trained military voices do, projection without shouting, authority without volume. Laura Bennett. Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. 8 years ago you participated in Operation Enduring Freedom, Helmand Province. During a convoy ambush near Sanjin Valley on March 14, 2015, you performed emergency field surgery under active fire. You stabilized 17 wounded Marines. You prevented 7 deaths. You were recommended for the Navy Cross. Nurses stopped. Parents with sick children stared. Someone's phone was recording. The light from the lobby windows caught the officer's collar insignia, a trident and a star. You were ordered into protective status for 8 years. Your military identity was classified. Your service was erased from public record. Your medical credentials were transferred to civilian practice under modified background review. This was authorized by Naval Special Warfare Command and coordinated with hospital administration. The SEAL team leader's eyes found Laura in the crowd. That status ends today. Welcome home, Senior Chief. Behind him, 2 Marine officers in dress uniforms stepped forward. A colonel and a lieutenant colonel. The colonel's face had the weathered authority of someone who'd spent 20 years in command, who'd seen what happened when you let people like Sterling operate without consequence. They moved toward the hospital administration offices with the lieutenant colonel stopping only to look directly at Laura. Dr. Sterling is in his office, the lieutenant colonel said, though his words carried to everyone in the lobby. We'd like to speak with him now. The escort happened at 9:43 a.m. in the main atrium. Shift change was happening, 47 staff members were coming in, clocking out, moving through. Security had called Sterling's office at 9:15. He'd tried to refuse, until the colonel's legal team explained that his credentials were under review for patient safety violations and his cooperation was non-negotiable. Sterling arrived at the atrium in a pressed dress shirt, trying to assemble authority-like armor. The colonel spoke first, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, barely audible but you could feel the mass of it. Dr. Sterling. Your interference with Senior Chief Bennett civilian placement violated operational security protocols established under Section 10 U.S.C. 132. Your investigation into her background accessed classified naval intelligence files without proper clearance. Your public harassment of a recovering Marine general constituted interference with medical care that would have resulted in the patient's death. Sterling's face reddened. I wasn't aware of any classified. You were informed by the patient that Senior Chief Bennett was former military. You ignored that information and continued your harassment. You then weaponized hospital policy to punish her for saving General Krause's life. The hospital CEO was standing 3 feet away, watching her liability increase with every second. The lieutenant colonel's voice dropped lower. Your medical credentials at Oak Creek Memorial are revoked effective immediately. You will surrender your hospital identification. Security will escort you from the premises. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the sound of it, the sound of a career ending, was Sterling's badge clattering onto the polished floor. He tried to maintain dignity as security moved toward him, but his hand shook as he removed his hospital ID. His eyes found Laura in the crowd, and for one moment they were back in the cafeteria, the tray falling, the laughter stopping, the words, "One day you'll understand what respect actually costs." One of the nurses he'd humiliated for 6 years whispered just loudly enough to carry, "Guess respect cost more than he thought." Sterling was escorted out through the same lobby doors where Laura had been walked out 48 hours earlier. This time, the crowd wasn't silent. Phones recorded. Some nurses nodded. One started clapping, and 2 others joined before it stopped, but the sound had happened. The acknowledgement had been made. 6 months later, someone spotted him at the Westgate strip mall on El Cajon Boulevard. Folding table. Stack of insurance policy documents. Tax prep franchise on one side, discount mattress store on the other. He was selling life insurance at $12 an hour, his medical career destroyed by a state board investigation that found him in violation of multiple patient care standards, not just Laura Bennett, but a documented pattern of harassment against female staff extending back 16 years. His network had collapsed. The hospital board members he'd called to support Laura's suspension were now distancing themselves from the investigation. The compliance investigator, Patricia Reeves, had received a formal inquiry from Naval Special Warfare Command and had immediately lawyered up. The video of him laughing in the cafeteria was still circulating, 3,000 shares on social media, his face recognizable, his career over. At Arlington National Cemetery, the morning was clear and sharp. Laura stood in dress white Navy uniform for the first time in 8 years, the fabric crisp and official after 8 years of living in scrubs. Her daughter sat in the front row, the faded unit patch Delta Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines professionally framed and held in Megan's lap like a prayer. Marine General Victor Krauser walked toward Laura with the slow, deliberate movements of a man still recovering from cardiac trauma. Still living. Still here because of the woman standing before him in whites. He carried 3 medals on a velvet presentation case. The Navy Cross. The cross itself was simple, a cross patty with an anchor at the center, suspended from a light blue ribbon with white edges. Extraordinary heroism. Nothing qualified as extraordinary except survival when survival shouldn't have been possible. He pinned it to Laura's chest. The sound of it was small, metal catching fabric, the delicate click of a uniform catching history. Then the bronze stars. 2 of them. Valor. Not the highest honor, but proof that what she'd done had been seen, witnessed, recognized by people who understood what warfare actually cost. The general's voice was low enough that only she and the front row could hear. "You saved my life twice, Senior Chief. Once in Helmand when you stabilized my nephew during that convoy ambush. Once at Oak Creek when you refused to let protocol kill me." Laura's eyes filled. One tear escaped and she let it fall without breaking her rigid attention stance. Her daughter watched her mother with tears streaming down her face, finally understanding why her mom had never talked about her past, why she'd absorbed insults with quiet dignity, why she'd picked up a cafeteria tray from the floor and said what respect actually costs instead of saying who she actually was. After the ceremony, when the Marine Honor Guard had folded the presentation flags and the photographers had documented the medals and the generals had shaken her hand and released her back to her life, Megan touched the Navy Cross on her mother's chest and whispered, "You told Dr. Sterling that one day he'd understand what respect costs. Did he ever figure it out?" Laura looked at her daughter and her voice came quiet and final, "Respect costs everything or it costs nothing. He chose nothing." They walked together from Arlington into the April sunlight, the Marine Honor Guard standing at attention as they passed. Behind them, the cemetery stretched toward forever, rows of white headstones, each one a person who understood what cost meant. The truth about heroism is that it doesn't announce itself. It arrives in scrubs. It picks up cafeteria trays without breaking eye contact. It holds its tongue for 8 years and then saves your life when the protocol says you're supposed to die. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the quietest one. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is disappear so completely that no one remembers who you actually were. Until the moment when staying quiet would cost a life. That's when masks come off. That's when buried identities resurface and transform entire institutions. That's when people like Sterling finally understand that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you've already earned years before anyone even knows your name. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub, saving lives in the dark. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever watched someone be underestimated and then vindicated, like and subscribe. Leave a comment about someone you know who deserves recognition they haven't received. And share this with someone who needs to know that buried strength never stays buried forever.